Welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us for this special webinar brought to you by the Open University Business School in support of Learning at Work Week. Could I just ask everyone to just type a very quick yes in the chat panel if you can hear me okay? I'm going to carry on and hope that we see some yeses. My name is Janet Barker and I'm the External Engagement Manager here at the Open University Business School. I'm delighted to be hosting today's session and equally delighted to be joined by Laurie Nell, who is an Associate Lecturer at the Open University Business School, as well as Director of Strategic Innovation Partners and co-founder of Brain for Business. Over the next 30 minutes, we want to share with you some of our perspectives and thoughts on modern empowerment in the workplace. We hope you'll find this interesting and thought-provoking. If you'd like to learn more, there is a link to a free online course in the resource section of the auditorium. The webinar is being hosted as part of Learning at Work Week, which is coordinated by the Campaign for Learning. It's an annual opportunity to celebrate and promote the benefits of workplace learning. All sorts of organisations are running all sorts of activities during the week, so please take time to visit the website to find out more. And again, a link is in the resources section of this auditorium. Over the next 30 minutes, you'll be able to interact with us. You'll see on your screen a chat panel, and we invite you to share your questions there. We'll try and answer as many of those as we can. Please note that if you are in full screen mode, you will not be able to see or use the chat facility. So if you wish to interact, please exit full screen mode first. If you're having trouble with your connection, please try refreshing your web page. There is a help button on your screens if you have any further problems. Just a reminder that this webinar will be recorded and available online after the session. If you have any colleagues who would have liked to have joined in but didn't make it, you can share this with them and you can catch up at any time. So it's over to Laurie to talk about why you and your employer should care about empowerment. Over to you, Laurie.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Janet. It's great to be speaking to you all. As Janet said, my name's Lawrence Snell, or Laurie, and I'm an Associate Lecturer with the Open University and the Open University Business School, and I've been working with the university for about 7 years now. Today's conversation, and I really do hope it is a conversation, is very much about empowerment, but looking at it from the perspective not of human resources, not about learning development, and definitely not from an academic perspective, but from the perspective of people in organizations, from managers, from the ordinary employee's perspective, but basically from everyone's perspective. And being a conversation, I would like to hear your thoughts and questions as we're going along. So definitely do use the chat box and we'll address them as we're going along. What are we going to be looking at then? Well, first of all, we're going to be asking a really simple question, but actually possibly quite a difficult question as well, and that is, how empowered are you? From there, starting to think a little bit about what is empowerment, and then looking at why you should care as individuals, but also why your employer should care. And I'm conscious when I say that some of you will both be in the position of employer, whether an employer directly or a manager of people. So I think there's a number of different perspectives that this can be looked at, and we're not going to be able to give definitive answers during today's session, but hopefully provoke some thinking and get you thinking about your own level of empowerment, but also those of any people who might work for you. So let's take that first question. How empowered are you? What would you say? Maybe drop a few comments in the box there. Would anyone consider themselves to be particularly empowered?
Hello, Laurie. There's not much coming through at the moment. I think some people are having a few sound issues. So can I just reiterate, if you are having sound issues, please just refresh your web page. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, very, Steve. Very good. Anyone else like to comment on that? And it is a difficult question in a lot of ways. Sarah, and in certain elements, you feel empowered to make decisions? Okay, Sarah as well. It depends on what context. Absolutely, Gemma. Well, As I said, it is an admittedly difficult question. It's a very broad question. It can depend on the context, depend on the particular meaning. In some areas of your role and some areas of your remit, you might feel very empowered, but actually in others, you may not. So we've put together a number of questions. And you might want to think, just privately, to what extent you agree or disagree with the following statements. First of all, I am involved in decisions that affect my work. Would you agree with this, or perhaps disagree, or partially agree or disagree? I'm not closely supervised at work. I can decide how I perform my work tasks. I feel my opinions about how best to perform my work tasks are listened to. And finally, I can listen to the goals, I can influence the goals and objectives of my job. Have a think about those questions, because the extent to which you agree or disagree might give you some guidance, some insight into the level of your own empowerment. But as we've already touched upon, it can very much depend on the context. And notice one person there said they're new to the role, so they're not necessarily feeling that empowered. And that's possibly quite natural as well. When you're new to a role, you're still learning. If you're still in that role, for example, in 2 years' time, let alone in 5 years or 10 years' time, then you would hope and you would assume that level of empowerment has increased. But I can also share with you something that a manager once said to me, and she once said to me, and she said this in all seriousness: you are fully empowered to make decisions in your role, as long as you check all of those before you make them. And to be honest with you, on a certain level, that was empowerment. I was given the authority to make decisions, and I had scope within my role, yet at the same time, it wasn't really. So what is going on? Well, clearly this is only 5 questions, and it's taken from a much larger set of questions that could be asked. But in order to address it properly, we also need to think about what is empowerment. And when it boils down to it, there are 2 key forms of empowerment. The first is what could be called structural empowerment. The second is what's called psychological empowerment. I'll touch on what these are in just a few moments, but suffice to say, these forms are not mutually exclusive. They can, and indeed they do, reinforce each other. So what are they? Well, structural empowerment is about power and decision making, the extent to which an organization, a manager, a leader, or indeed the processes within an organization allow power and decision making to be shared downwards within an organization. And essentially, it comes down to the extent to which employees, the individuals, are empowered to make decisions within the scope of their job. And that's an important point to note. It's within the scope of their job. So you might be a marketing manager, for example, and within the scope of your role as a marketing manager, you should, hopefully and ideally, feel empowered. However, if I were to come to you and ask you to redesign or to make decisions about the finance function or the operations function or IT, you actually may not be that empowered to make those decisions. And on a certain level, I'm sure we can all agree, that makes sense. It's common sense that if your area of specialty is in one field, then your ability to influence and to make decisions about another field, which is outside the scope and the remit of your role, should by definition be relatively limited. But a key part of this notion of structural empowerment is participative decision making. So it's hinting at the fact that decision-making should move up and down within the organization and with different levels of the chain of command and what might be called a hierarchy. But also to support that, there should be a relatively open flow of information up and down within the organization. So you know what you need to know, and perhaps you even know more than that. Some organizations are very good at sharing information right down to the last detail of the finances. Others tend to keep it a bit closer in. A lot of that comes down to culture, both organizational culture, but also national culture. These things have a precedent, particularly in smaller organizations, though, maybe family-run companies and businesses. There can be a tendency to keep information close. That sort of fear that if people know too much, it might lead to trade secrets being given away. And there's a point that that might be completely valid, but at the same time, information has to flow so that people can do their job. The second form of empowerment that I touch upon, psychological empowerment, and this focuses on the beliefs that people hold about their job, firstly, but also their employer. And it's really about employees and individuals being encouraged, firstly, to identify with the purpose and the values of the organization. To what extent do they identify with what the organization does and what the organization is about? So you might imagine, for example, that someone working for a charity, where maybe they're not being paid a huge amount of money, actually identifies very strongly with the purpose and the values of the organization. It's something they strongly believe in, and they might have chosen to work in that context. On the other hand, you might have some people work in organizations, and perhaps they're actually paid quite a bit of money, but they may not really identify that much with the purpose and values, as long as they're getting what they perhaps want from the organization, compensation, and so on. But then there's also a third way, and you see that coming through particularly in, say, the technology companies, where they develop this sense of purpose, this mission, and people are invited to buy into it. So it actually becomes more than just about putting a search engine, for example, not having a go at Google or any other company when I say that, it's more than about putting a search engine out onto the internet. It's about changing the way people live their lives. So it's going almost for a high level purpose. And in that sense, it also links to people and individuals having self-belief in their ability, in their skills, and their capabilities, and indeed their competence to deliver on the job, on their role, and also to impact on the organization. So if people identify with what the organization is about, and they believe very strongly in their ability to impact and influence on that, then you're hitting a really fantastic point in terms of outcomes, both for the individual and the organization, as long as the individual has autonomy about how their work is done. So it's focusing very much on the goals, but actually leaving space for the individual, in an ideal world, to think for themselves about how they deliver on those goals. Do they spend 8 hours a day in the office, or 10 hours, or 6 hours, or whatever it is? Or actually, do they spend some time working from home? Do they choose other options? Do they have that flexibility? And in that regard, it's very similar to what could be called employee engagement. So let's think then, if they're the two essential types of empowerment, at least as they relate to the workforce and to the world of work, why should you care about empowerment? Any simple, quick answers from people? Why should you care about empowerment?
While we're waiting for people to type, Laurie, we've had some interesting comments about the empowerment so far. We've had lots of people saying it depends on what context. Linda says, ask for forgiveness, not permission, ... if it works, which I think is great. Heather says she has too many processes to go to. So I'll leave it there. There are many more, but we're getting a few through. Would you like me to read them?
No, well, I can see we have a few people coming through on that question that I posed just there a moment ago. So we might perhaps go to that, Janet. And that is why you should care about empowerment. I noticed there's a few people highlighting job satisfaction, motivation, organizational effectiveness as a very high-level umbrella term. Motivation seems to be coming through quite a lot, and I think that's really important, and that perhaps links to the point about discretionary effort. Okay, excellent. Some really interesting perspectives. So let's have a look at what we might say are reasons to care for individuals about empowerment. So, on the one hand, it can be about maximizing your potential, being given the space to explore what you want to explore and to achieve what you want to achieve, rather than necessarily being told to sit in a proverbial box and just do what you're told. I think those days, hopefully, are very much gone. That sort of command and control management is something which is hopefully a thing of the past. And from that, though, giving you the scope to access more interesting, but also absorbing work. The sorts of things that not only do you want to do, but actually really, really excite you and make you passionate, to use what could be possibly a bit of a cliche term. And from that, then, having greater control over what you do, making better decisions, and ultimately being more productive and achieve more. So all of these things lead to that point about organizational effectiveness, but also motivation. Because the idea is that there is a link between people having more interesting work, enriched work, to put it in terms of motivation theory, and also being more motivated. They want to achieve more, and they're able to achieve more, so they do. But it's also, given the current climate and some of the issues that have emerged in the last 6 to 12 months, it's also worth noting that empowerment is very much also about inclusion. And it's about ensuring that people are included and have a sense for themselves of their own degree of inclusion within the workplace. It's not just about empowering one group of people in an ideal world. It's about empowering everyone. And so for you as an employee, putting that hat on for a moment, it is critical that you allow these benefits to be enjoyed by everyone. It's not just about your empowerment, it's also about the empowerment of other people within the organization. Is there any other comments come through, Janet, that you think are worth commenting with? Sure.
Steve has said, can people be too empowered? Which is interesting.
That is a very interesting question. Let me perhaps just take that for a moment, Janet. I suspect, actually, Steve and everyone, yes, people perhaps can be too empowered if it detracts from actually the focus of the organization. You may have heard of the 20% of time that Google and some other organizations give different groups of employees to focus on new ideas and their own projects. If it turned out that people were spending 100% of their time working on new projects that didn't necessarily relate to the organization, then I would say that actually they are too empowered. Now, 100%, that possibly shouldn't happen, but even if it was 50%, if people weren't necessarily doing what they are meant to do and what the organization needs to do in any shape or form, then you could argue that empowerment has possibly gone too far. Any other comments, Janet?
Actually, that leads in nicely to one that Graham made earlier, that not being closely supervised does not necessarily mean one is empowered. So that's an interesting comment as well. So
I would agree, because I think that could almost be a sink or swim, or reflective, in some cases anyway, of almost a slightly macho culture of like, well, if you're good enough to be in this organization, you should be able to do it without necessarily being told. But actually, at a certain point, we all need support, we all need help, and we all need to perhaps to be given guidance.
Indeed. And Ross says, command and control is alive and well, especially in safety critical industry, which is very true, no doubt.
It is, and I think command and control is definitely alive in organizations where processes need to be followed. And safety critical industries would be those where processes need to be followed for very valid reasons. You need people to do certain things in order to maintain and ensure their own safety, as well as those that they're working with, or perhaps, if, for example, if they're an airline pilot, you want them to be able to make decisions, but you also need them to follow processes. It is a balance, and I think that's something that perhaps also leads then nicely, if I can move on at this point to the next question, which is, why should employers care about empowerment? And there's been a lot of really interesting work done in this area, because on the one hand you could say, well, it's obvious we should care about empowerment as employers, but well, that's an assumption, and that takes a lot of things for granted. But it's worth highlighting a very recent article from Harvard Business Review, which is called "When Empowering Employees Works and When It Doesn't." It's only about a month or two old, so if you haven't seen it, it can be worth digging out. But the authors of that highlight a number of things. First of all, that empowering leaders are much more effective at influencing employee creativity and citizenship behavior than routine task performance. So leaders who focus on empowering their people are very good at drawing out this creativity. And so when we're talking about that command and control environment, a real challenge can be getting people to think creatively when you need them to. At the same time, though, citizenship behaviors is what's often called discretionary effort, and that's something that was touched upon already. But there's also the flip side of that from an employer's perspective, and that is that by empowering employees, leaders are also more likely to be regarded positively and trusted by their subordinates compared to those who don't empower them. So you see two sides of the fence coming through. It's good for the employees, but also good for the managers and therefore for the organization. But finally, and I think this is a very important point, the third bullet point here, highlighting that while a lot of these management speak phenomena, such as, if I'm honest, engagement and empowerment, can seem quite Western and possibly even US-centric, the authors of this study highlighted that empowerment in some cases actually works much better in what they call Eastern culture. So the cases they're looking at are in China. So it's something that has a universal appeal. It's not just something limited to particular cultures. But let's boil it down a bit further. Some of the really basic points, and this goes back to 2012, about why employers should care about empowerment. Greater trust, fairness, and openness in the workplace. If you are talking to your people and your employees, then chances are they're going to talk to you as well, and they're going to feel that they're being treated more fairly. You also see more harmonious relationships coming through. People talk and people try to find a win-win solution to problems and to conflict. Empowerment leads to greater employee engagement. Employees are treated as stakeholders, and employees are more committed to the interests of the organization. So this is very much that psychological empowerment that we were touching upon earlier on. So empowerment has so many different benefits, and as the previous research that I mentioned hinted at, it's not just something that applies in certain cultures, certain national cultures, over others. It applies in various cultures. Any particular questions or comments come through, Janet, that are worth picking up on?
There's an interesting one from Mohammed. Sorry, it's just moved up. Empowered employees are likely to take more initiatives, think more out of the box, and initiate change dialogues. Yeah,
absolutely. And that links very much to the point that I made a second ago about creativity. And there's a really interesting concept in military organizations. The American military came up with the term the creativity conundrum, which is really about how do you get people to follow the rules in certain situations, but then also be able to and want to think independently in other situations. Now, as I said, that comes from a military context, but you can also see that in any organization, particularly those, as we touched upon earlier on, with a very strong command and control context. Any other comments worth highlighting, Janet?
Yes, Bridget made a very good point in it helps with retention of talent in a very competitive job market.
Yeah, absolutely. It's critical for talent retention, particularly if, to use the cliche term, that war for talent is still thriving in your industries, then it is absolutely critical. People feel they're bought in, they have a role, they're able to speak and say what they need to say.
Yes, and Susan says she feels that people are confusing empowerment with free rein. Empowerment goes hand in hand with clear and reasonable boundaries.
Yeah, absolutely, Susan. I think that goes back to the comment I made earlier on about if you're a marketing manager, you should be hopefully empowered within the scope of your role as a marketing manager. But that doesn't necessarily mean you can go off and make significant decisions about the IT function without perhaps necessarily being invited or being involved there. So boundaries are key. What I'd like to talk about now, though, is the flip side of empowerment, because we can talk all day about how great empowerment is and how brilliant it is for us as individuals and for organizations, but actually there is such a thing as the empowerment paradox. And the empowerment paradox is real because when you build strong levels of empowerment and people feel committed and they feel as though they're responsible and they're able to make decisions and that they have a stake in the company and that they have an impact and they're able to make a difference, you find that if it's not controlled, certain negative behaviors can come through. People can work long hours, too long hours, because they feel, I'm committed, I believe in this, so I'm going to stay and I'm going to work ridiculous hours. Work can also become much more intensive because people can sometimes tend to take on more work because, hey, I'm part of this great, amazing project that we're all together on, and I'm going to do it. And that discretionary effort could go overboard. That can all lead to high stress levels and a risk of burnout. But then you'll also see that despite empowerment growing, the gender pay gap remains. Again, in the last 6 to 12 months, we've seen in major organizations and in the UK and indeed around the world that this gender pay gap is very, very real. And while steps have been taken to try and address it, it's still there. We've also seen that unions have been weakened because people are saying, well, I don't need a union because I'm empowered. And that's absolutely fine, as long as empowerment is not being used as a cynical tool by an organization. As part of this, the gig economy has grown. People are taking on more part-time roles. And equally, and finally, we're now all accountable, no matter what. So people can often feel under pressure. So while empowerment has lots of fantastic qualities and can bring a lot to people and to the organization, there are challenges.
Talking of challenges, Laurie,
yep.
Sorry to interrupt you. We're starting to get close to one, so I thought I'd let you know.
That's absolutely fine. And I wish I could keep going, so apologies if I've been talking too long, everyone. But I just want to throw out a few final questions because it's important to think about not just about your own empowerment and that of the people perhaps working with you, but that also of empowerment. What is the future of empowerment generally? Are the benefits real, or is it just a fad that's going to be disappearing and fading over time? Is it absolutely necessary in order to attract and retain employees? We've already touched upon that. Or should people just be happy to have a job and have money, get paid? Or is empowerment just about working harder? You could ask lots of really difficult questions. And I don't necessarily know if we know the answer to these. Maybe in 5, 10 years' time we will. But right now, I'm not sure we do. So I'm curious now, any questions, any thoughts that people might have?
There's a couple of, there's lots of very interesting ones. But Steve mentioned that what is empowerment for me is not necessarily empowerment for another person. How do we ensure we're all aligned and manage those differences?
Yeah, absolutely, Steve. I'm working on a project at the moment looking at collaboration. And for some people, they perhaps have a role where they travel the world and are constantly on the road. So for them, being able to collaborate is all about technology. You have someone, though, who works 9 to 5 in the office, doesn't deal with anyone else outside that office. Collaboration is very, very different. And the same with empowerment. We're all different. And I think in that sense, it's very much about understanding each individual, the role they're doing, and what they want. What is important to them. There is no one-size-fits-all approach.
Thank you. And Ryan says, just thinking sometimes if you are stressed at work, in my opinion, if you are feeling empowered, wouldn't that stress go away?
Well, I think that's the beauty of the paradox that we touched upon there, Ryan, because in an ideal world, yes, but actually what if that empowerment is leading to the stress? And you feel as though you have to take on more because the company or the organization has given me this empowerment, so I need to take advantage of that, and I can't say no, and I need to be a great team player, and so on. So ideally, yes, but actually, I'm not sure it necessarily works that way.
Okay, thank you, Laurie. I'm going to stop it there. And I'd just like to say thank you, Laurie. That, as usual, that was a fascinating subject, and thank you very much. I'd also like to thank everybody who joined us online today. You've been absolutely a wonderful interactive audience, and I am sorry that we couldn't get to all your questions. They've all been great. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Don't forget to enjoy the rest of the Learning at Work week and find out what's going on out there. Thanks again. So goodbye.
Thank you very much, everyone. Great speaking to you all.